We welcome Derek Young of On3's K-State Online. And Derek, I'm very excited for the rest of the world to get to know Avery Johnson. It's something that we've talked about a ton on this show. But I'm curious, now that you getting to see a little bit of camp with Avery Johnson as QB1 for K-State, what do you think this offense is going to look like with him running it, with Colin Klein no longer running it?
Yeah, that's the interesting part, because you assume that the legs are going to play a pretty large role in what they do, just because he's probably the fastest player on the team, one of the fastest players in college football, but they are very insistent on wanting to highlight his arm and proving that he's just as good of a passer. And part of that's because that's what he wants to do. He wants to kind of defeat some of those stereotypes that say he's just a runner and not a passer. And he certainly can sling it, but a lot of what we've seen in training camp thus far is obviously less of the running, just because he's not live, but even more so just playing more of a distributor role, because they are a lot more improved at the skill positions this year.
Well, and that's what I was going to ask, because Dylan Edwards was the big name pickup because he's from Kansas. We saw him, had the big breakout at Colorado as a true freshman against TCU. But they bring in Dante Cephas, who was a big name transfer last year from Kent State to Penn State, but he didn't really do much at Penn State. So he comes to K-State. And then who are some of the other pass catchers? I say pass catchers because, like, Ben Sinnott was one of their better receivers last year at tight end. They got to replace him too.
Yeah. Now, a lot of these guys, well, I think all of these guys you would consider not to be proven commodities at this point, but all high upside players. Garrett Oakley will replace Ben Sinnott at tight end. And obviously Ben Sinnott was just an NFL second-round pick. But people around the program will tell you that Garrett Oakley probably has more upside than Ben Sinnott. The difference being that he's not done it yet, so he still has to prove himself. You mentioned Dante Cephas. He was a big-name transfer at some point. You hope that the lack of production at Penn State might have been the product of the Penn State offense not necessarily being all that explosive in years past. Certainly before adding Andy Kotelnicki now as their offensive coordinator. Keegan Johnson was another player that was known to be kind of an explosive weapon in his short glimpses as a true freshman at Iowa. He was the best wide receiver at training camp last year, and then he got hurt and just never could put it together for Kansas State. And their best returning receiver, it could be Johnson, but if not, it's Jace Brown, who as a true freshman last season probably became the best wide receiver by season's finish and had a big game against Texas.
So Avery Johnson has some people to throw to. The other question is, who's he in the mesh with? Because I think that's the part that's going to scare some defenses. When you got DJ Giddens coming back, it was 1,000-yard back last year, and then you add Dylan Edwards to the mix as kind of that third down back dude who can catch the ball out of the backfield. That's where I think Avery Johnson's legs become more dangerous.
Yeah, I think his legs will be kind of more of a threat to open up space for everybody else. Like the tight end, Garrett Oakley, I think he could be someone that is the recipient of a lot of attention being paid to Avery Johnson's legs or to Dylan Edwards, because you put Dylan Edwards in motion, you're going to get a lot of false steps from a defense. And so I think those guys can, just as much as they can be used with the ball in their hands, will be great decoys as well and open up things for, like you said, DJ Giddens, who probably is the most probably forgotten player on this Kansas State team because of how easily it is to address the Avery Johnson, to address the Dylan Edwards, maybe the most forgotten player in the Big 12, because rightfully so, it's a pretty good running back league this year.
Yeah, it's a great running back league.
Ollie Gordon's probably head and shoulders above everybody else. And one of my favorites is also Devin Neal from Kansas. But because of those two, I think it's easy to forget about DJ Giddens.
Yeah, it really is a loaded running back league, and because you talk about Giddens, RJ Harvey at UCF, the Jaheim White, CJ Donaldson 1-2 punch at West Virginia. Like, you better come with a pretty stout D line and some linebackers who can fill their gaps in the Big 12. Speaking of which, thought it was interesting that Joe Klannerman, the DC at Kansas State the other day, said he thought this is the most talented K-State defense under Chris Kleiman. And I think about the one 2 years ago that had Felix Anudike-Uzomah, Juju Brents, like that was a pretty talented bunch. How does this one really stack up?
Yeah, I kind of quibble with him a little bit because I think it's hard to be as talented when you're not going to have at least proven guys. Like you went into 2022 knowing who Felix Anudike-Uzomah was, knowing who Julius Brents was. I think you may have guys with similar upsides at best, but they're not as proven going in. They think that they have some future stars at defensive end, but those guys haven't done it yet. And Jordan Allen and Chidi Obiizor, whose brother was a star linebacker, still is a star linebacker at TCU. More proven in the secondary. I think even without a Juju Brents, I think this has a chance to be the deepest and best secondary under Chris Kleiman at Kansas State, because I think Marquise Siegel is all Big 12 caliber at safety. VJ Payne might be all Big 12 caliber at safety, and they brought in one of the best defensive back transfers in the Big 12, and Jordan Riley, and bring back both of your starting corners. So I think the strength of this defense is probably the back end. The most upside is probably a defensive end, but those just aren't the guys that have done it yet.
So I've been going back and forth on this. I'm trying to figure this out, and maybe you can help me. Is it an advantage to be playing Arizona in a non-conference game, or a because for those who don't know, Kansas State and Arizona were going to play anyway this year, and then they wound up in the same conference, and the Big 12 just said, keep the game. We'll call it a non-conference game. But so K-State in week 3 on a Friday night gets one of the most talented teams in the league in a game that doesn't count in the league standings. Is that like good practice, Derek, or is that you're really kicking yourself if you win that and it doesn't count?
Yeah, I'm probably somewhere in the middle, because if you get that win, you probably wish that it would count, because Arizona could be a factor in the Big 12 race. So it makes sense from that standpoint. On the other side of it, I believe the 4 picked at the bottom of the Big 12, Kansas State's the only team that gets to play all 4. So you do get
We'll take that one.
Yeah. So if by dodging Arizona, maybe it's why you get the Arizona States, the Cincinnati, the Houstons, and the BYU all on your schedule, where I don't think anyone else has that luxury. Here's something I have kind of went back and forth on is I think this Kansas State team is actually, it's got the upside and it's good enough to win the Big 12 this year, no doubt about it. But it's probably more built for 2025, when all of these stars that they're going to count on this year have that first year under their belt. But you go back and forth with that, because this year's schedule is probably the most conducive to winning the Big 12, because they do get all of Arizona, Oklahoma State, and KU at home and don't have to play Utah.
Yeah. At West Virginia is the one that feels a little tricky there, because they're going to be pretty good this year. And I don't think enough people are talking about that. But I mean, the Big 12 is just going to be a knife fight every week, it feels like. Yeah,
that West Virginia game is tricky. Now, it's funny because the Mountaineers could be better this year and have a far worse record, because if you their schedule, it's probably the most complicated one in the Big 12. I mean, you could find 6 or 7 losses on their schedule pretty easily, despite being better. But the location and the spot of when Kansas State plays them is probably the most difficult part, because you play Colorado in the Mountain Time Zone the week before, a game that, even if Colorado isn't any good, every player wants to play Colorado right now. So you get up for that one. So maybe you get in a letdown situation when you play in 2 time zones over 6 or 7 days later. And then right after West Virginia, you kind of get into that look ahead spot too, because the Sunflower Showdown's the following week.
And the Sunflower Showdown may be a very big game in the Big 12 this year. How much is it? Like, obviously, Chris Kleiman carried on what Bill Snyder was doing and kept Kansas State good. But how much does Lance Leipold and what he's done at Kansas enhance that rivalry? And I mean, it is a real rivalry again. It's actually, you actually think about who might win and who might lose now.
Yeah, it's kind of that way in both sports, right? Kansas State has elevated their play in basketball to kind of give
Jerome Tang, absolutely.
To give KU something to worry about in basketball, but now KU and Lance Leipold are giving Kansas State something to worry about in football. It's a live rivalry in football where, for years it wasn't. I mean, still technically, your fans probably say it still isn't. I think they've won 16 or 17 straight over Kansas, but as long as Lance Leipold is there, that streak is eventually going to finish. Now, I wouldn't call it this year, just because Kansas State's still really good and they are the home team. But this is the one that KU will want really, really badly, because they're losing a lot of their core after this season. So they feel like they have to get Kansas State this year, because it'll be much tougher to do so next year.
And we talked about this a little in a Game Time ad earlier in the show, but early season, week 2, K-State at Tulane. How purple is that stadium going to be? That I imagine that's a pretty sought after road trip for the K-State fans.
Yeah, if they didn't go to the Sugar Bowl a couple years ago, probably more so because they were just in New Orleans.
But there's no Alabama there this time.
Yeah, that's true. What I will say, and there's another thing too, kind of in play. The last time they played Tulane, they lost.
That's true.
But
That's
Willie
right.
Fritz is no longer the coach.
Willie Fritz is at Houston, so they're going to see Willie Fritz just in a different color.
But the last time they did lose to Tulane, that was the year they won the Big 12.
That's it, and played Alabama in the Sugar Bowl, and it's all coming full circle. So, well, if you need to know what to order at Giacomo's, you just call me. Let me know. Yep. We'll get you right, because it's one of those places that you will regret everything you didn't order. So I envy you getting that trip, but it's going to be a fun year for K-State. I can't wait. And it's interesting because you mentioned maybe it is more built for 2025. Like every player you were mentioning to me, like sophomores, redshirt sophomores, like it is a young team, but it does seem like it's set to compete now.
Yeah, they have the defense definitely to win the Big 12, and it'll have to carry them, I think, early, because that offense, you would anticipate some growing pains, a new offensive coordinator, a lot of new pieces on the offensive line. So those are things to take into consideration, maybe some things that bite you eventually. We'll see. But, I've seen a few practices to this point. What I will say is they're a lot longer and a lot deeper on defense, and they are a lot faster on offense.
It'll be fun to watch, Derek Young. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for watching. Just a reminder, subscribe to this channel right here so you never miss an episode of Andy Staples on 3. And oh, by the way, watch all the other great videos on the On3 Sports YouTube channel.